So Sam Higgins, I'm one of the principal analysts at Forrester, and I have a confession. I'm second generation IT. My father was a COBOL programmer, and I was originally a COBOL programmer, and all of my family still think I can fix their printer. So I'm sure you all can appreciate that, as many of us who have been in the industry a long time know. I think I liked Rajesh's example there of the doctor. I've got doctors in the family, and I think they're sick of COVID questions. So maybe now they know how we feel about their printer questions. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about printers. I'm here to talk about a bit of a deep dive from where Rajesh took us earlier around kind of this idea of the future of work and how it does pave a path to better customer obsession through, of course, a better employee experience. And given the changing nature of work, what some of the implications will be for you. Rajesh just touched on some of those, but I want to dive in a bit deeper and peel the onion back in terms of some of the research that we've done at Forrester, some of the frameworks we're using to help you think about how you deal with that problem in maybe a little bit more of the near term, as well as share with you some of our more recent data on kind of how many of your employees and your professional colleagues are thinking about the anywhere work problem. But first of all, welcome to the 2020s. It's probably fair to say that we're in a decade of less prosperity-driven decadence and maybe a little bit more of uncertainty-driven hardship. And for those of us with mortgages and rising interest rates, I'm sure we understand what that might be, let alone inflation, supply chain challenges. I did try and buy some eggs the other day at Woolies. It was very difficult. But there are lots of analogies between the 1920s and the 2020s that are worth reflecting on. Obviously, after World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic hit the world. At the same time, around the 20s, there was a massive shift in technology, right? Electrification of the world and the adoption of radio was massive, right? These were fundamental. Not to mention the advent of the motor car. And believe it or not, on that picture of Wall Street in New York, there is actually an electric vehicle. Fun historical fact. Turned out, much like railways in LA, it got taken out by the competition. And the other thing that changed was the relationship between employees and employers, right? The Ford Motor Company started to pay above market wages to attract meat packers, right, from docks onto production line to produce those very cars, to produce that new technology. And then our own George Edward Mayo, an Adelaide-born organisational psychologist, or the father of human resources, decided that we could measure the productivity of employees by looking at their outputs. And so that was what we saw 100 years ago. And while it is a poor analogy, we're obviously in a situation now where we are seeing another pandemic. We are seeing this sort of systemic shock. We've got new technology. Rajesh mentioned AI, other technologies. I'm not going to talk about the metaverse today, but we could go there another time. We've got a changing relationship between employees and employers, right? An increasing amount of employee power. We probably don't notice that as much here in Australia as we do in some other markets that I cover, both in Asia and also Europe and North America, where, some of the industrial relations protections and workers' rights are not as strong as they are in other markets. But certainly we're seeing those changes rippling out throughout the globe. And then finally, it's not just about measuring employees anymore, it's also about measuring customers, right? So, our own Mr. Famous Jeff Bezos, let's measure customer experience, let's measure customer satisfaction, let's focus on single numbers and that nature. So there are some parallels. But the other thing that's happening is that we have entered a period where one of those shocks, the pandemic, right? So one of those four changes that we're seeing in the market has accelerated digital transformation. And interestingly, what that does is it, despite the fact that it is technology focused, as Rajesh said, what this does mean is it provides us with much more human-centered or people-centric opportunities, right? When we automate mundane tasks, where we can shift work to occur wherever it might be. And that work, as Rajesh said, is both work for customers as well as work for employees. And all of these shocks, all of the advent of robotics, all of the amount of data we now have on employees and the things we have to manage to make sure that we understand where they're at, what they're doing, and that change in employee power, all of these shocks have driven us to a place that most of us refer to now as the future of work, which is kind of ironic because it's here now. So Maybe it's the now of work. But whatever it is the new reality of how things get done in an enterprise. And particularly, it changes the way that organisations think about who does work, what work is being done, and where that work gets done. And it's those three things that I want to talk about for a few minutes before we dive into really an unpacking of how we respond to the where component of this future of work. So when we say who, it changes the who, right? These shocks, this systemic risks. Suddenly we had no immigration in Australia. We had no borders open. So those of us that might have had, partners working offshore or who regularly travelled as part of our business, all of that changed, right? So that impacted who it was that was working. But it's not only those sorts of things, it's also things like automation. So the who of work could actually be our robotic employees, right? Does anyone here have an RPA platform? Anyone using bots in their business at the moment? Yep, a couple of people. Yeah, so, often when we hear people using robotic process automation, they will talk about, right, the number of bots as though they're people. Some people like to give them names, some people like to give them team names, but certainly the way we think about that, because of the nature of robotic process automation, is we think of them as a different type of employee. And then, of course, there's the gig economy, right, which we hear a lot about. The reality is, I think for many of us, I was certainly a contractor for about a third of my career. You are part of that economy, part of that flexible contingent labour base that changes over time. And you can see there that, in any given week here in Australia, people are regularly interacting with contractors and consultants. For example, we have actually 14% of people report to us that they interact with 26 or more contractors or consultants in a given week. So that just goes to show you the portion of people that aren't necessarily part of our traditional hierarchical permanent workforce. So the who of work is very different. It's burstable. It has, digital and physical workers in it. It's not the same work that my father was doing 50 years ago. The other thing is what work gets done is changing. So as we automate mundane tasks, we change the very nature of what it is that we do as individuals, right? We lift humans up to do more of what humans do well, right? Which is empathise, which is communicate, which is problem solve, which is deal with complex, multiple contexts all at the one time. Now, absolutely, the tide is rising on some of the roles that we see in the enterprise in terms of the capability of AI and process automation and the like. But the reality is that often what that does is just creates an automation paradox. It creates a situation where what's left behind from the robots is actually things that only humans can deal with, right? They become that complicated, right? And that's very true when we think about IT service management and IT delivery. The more of these sort of AI ops and automated workflows that we develop, the more we're actually left to solve, as Rajesh said, the more complicated symptoms, the more complicated diseases, the more complicated problems that we will encounter or that our employees or customers will encounter in our ever increasingly complex IT environment. Now in Australia, the reality of this is actually that we will actually have 1.7 new jobs over the next decade created by automation. But the net result will be that we'll actually lose about 1 million jobs. Now, that's not to say that 1 million people are going to lose their jobs, just that those jobs will disappear, we'll no longer do them anymore, right? And there's many cases over time that we've done that. We certainly shouldn't panic. It's not a revolt of the robots. Most of what we will do will be augmented work, right? And we'll be getting rid of that drudgery that we don't want to do. So what we do is fundamentally changing. And of course, what we want to talk in more depth about today is where that work gets done, right? And this idea that, in the past, as Rajesh said, the expectation was we would all come to the office and maybe, you had negotiated remote work, or maybe you were in a digital startup where, you used a bit of shared office space or WeWork. But the reality post-pandemic is that we estimate around 70% of organisations worldwide will actually be a combination of either mostly anywhere or office plus anywhere work, right? And that's pretty significant. Now, there are some subtle differences regionally, but certainly here in Australia, where 90% of employees work in the services sector, right, we're not necessarily bound to production lines, like you would find, for example, in manufacturing centres in some states in India, or the manufacturing that you find in Shenzhen in China. We don't have that constraint, so actually it could be higher than that in Australia, right? Because the fact that we just are much more of a services-oriented economy. But it does mean that we need to kind of, understand the different options. How flexible are we going to be in this anywhere work? Is it fully flexible? Do we let the employee make all the choices? Fully democratised, as Rajesh said, or is there some sort of guided approach? And then, is the stance we have, even if it is guided, that we're anywhere first? So actually the first class employee experience we have to build is one that assumes that people will not be in an office and might sometimes, under guidance, attend a particular physical location, which might itself not be an office. It just could be a shared space. Or is it hybrid work? Are we expecting that the office will play a kind of permanent role, or at least a key role in our thinking? So these are the sort of the three big changes that are going to arise from those fundamental shocks that I outlined before that we've got coming into the 2020s. And all of these things, the pandemic, the automation, the choices about who, where and what is being done with work are all big impacts on the key predictors of employee engagement. And it's really important that we understand the relationship, the way Rajesh outlined, between customer experience and employee experience, right? This is critical. Happy customers do require empowered employees, exactly as Rajesh had on his slide, right? What's interesting is that there are 5 predictors that Forrester has identified that tell you whether you're going to get an engaged employee. And they are things like that they have the opportunity to advance in their work, that they have a boss that recognises that they're doing good work. But the one that I want to talk about today is that the company does a good job of providing an environment where I can be productive. And a critical element of that is the technology that we use, right? Because if the where is flexible, the thing that is constant is the technology experience that I have. And so it turns out to be the biggest component of this particular driver for employee engagement. So get this wrong, and chances are you're going to erode engagement, and you will therefore erode your customer experience, and that will erode your business performance. Now, interesting, you can see there the global number is 55%. In Australia, employees actually report a much lower response to this question when it comes to how productive the environment is for them. Only 49% of Australian information workers, remember, information workers, service workers, 90% of employees in Australia are basically saying that, no, we're not up to par. We don't do a good enough job. Now, it's interesting because if we reflect back on what happened in the pandemic, it's quite interesting when we asked people at the start of the pandemic, okay, so what do you think is going to happen? Are you going to get disrupted by the virus? Yep, 80% of people said, yep, it's going to upset the way I'm doing work. They actually said that nearly 70% of the firms they worked for had the technology to allow them to work remotely. And as Rajesh said, there was definitely an interest back then at the start of 2020 in continuing to operate in a remote work environment once the crisis had ended. And of course, I don't know exactly when the crisis has ended. We say post-pandemic a lot, but I don't know exactly what that means at the moment. The tail end of the pandemic. It's a very long tail pandemic. This one I expect will be around for a while. But that was the state then. We also asked people like yourselves, people like me in the industry, well, what did we think the situation was? Well, 90% of firms said, yep, we transitioned workers to homework, no problems. They actually were, 90% transitioned to remote workers. 41% said that they were ready to do that. So even though 90% of us did it, only 41% said they were ready to do it. Still says we did a pretty good job. I think, as Rajesh said, the heroes in the room, right, besides the nurses and doctors, I think in those first few weeks of the pandemic, economically, were certainly IT professionals. And while individuals, 54% of individuals said, yep, I want to work remotely after the pandemic ended, only 48% expected the rate to be higher, right, from an IT professional perspective. So a little bit of a mismatch between the two. I think if we think about where we are today, nearly, 2 and a bit years past that point, the expectation, I think, that individuals had versus the reality of what we're finding in this anywhere work model really needs to be called out, right? I think the expectation was, if you looked online and let Google's algorithm do the searching for you, we should all be working in Bali, right? And just occasionally dialing in for a conference, right? Or Spain or somewhere nice like you can see on my right. The reality is that a lot of us occasionally go into work and we sit lonely and bored in the foyer with the coffee shop shut and nobody around to talk to, except maybe ourselves, which from time to time I'm known to do. But be that as it may, there is a real problem in terms of what it was we all expected and the reality that we're encountering. And so we need to understand that customer expectation on us, the expectation on us of the employee as a customer of IT and what it is we need to meet that. And so it's important, I think, that despite doing all of that great work, despite being heroes of the pandemic and getting everyone remote work, we have to be prepared that we don't let the pendulum swing too far, right? We need to think about this in a little bit more detail because, as Rajesh said, actually there is this really strong link between how employees are feeling and what they want and what customers get. They're inherently linked. And if we get it wrong, if we over pivot on one and we give this great digital experience to customers, right, but the anywhere work experience of our employees is inconsistent or they're confused or we don't know what we're doing, right, then we're actually going to have a material impact on performance. Because if you can get customer experience and employee experience right, then you'll get a 3.4 times lift in your financial performance. Right, which, if we're looking for more money to invest in more managed engine tools or just getting some nicer desktops or laptops or maybe some decent webcams, we probably want good financial performance. As a sales director once said to me in a business, Sam, with revenue comes opportunity, right? And so it's sort of incumbent on all of us to think about how we can make the business perform better. And so we shouldn't over pivot on one or the other of these, but we do need to manage this kind of shifting expectation that we see in customers. And by customers, for us, I mean including employees. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that realising the benefits of anywhere work doesn't also mean that we have to necessarily eliminate office-based work. Now, that doesn't mean that as businesses we might have a permanent office, but we've still got to recognise that people operate in teams. We are inherently social animals, right? Billions of years of evolution, probably hard to change that. I was saying, Rajesh and I were actually talking, I don't eat before a presentation, right? It's not because I have particular nerves about doing presentations. It's part of my job. I quite like doing presentations. There's a primitive part of my brain that gets nervous and my stomach shuts down, and so eating's not a great idea, right? Same thing. We like to work in teams. We like to be with people. Sitting in that foyer all alone with a closed coffee shop, not much fun. The other thing that we talked about is that there are some verticals where you just can't divorce the knowledge work from the production work. I said in Australia that's not as prevalent as it is in other parts of Asia Pacific because we are such service-based economies. That doesn't mean everybody can do it, right? Very hard for doctors and nurses under all circumstances to do everything via telehealth, right? There is a portion of things that require physical interaction. And then, of course, there is the fact that everybody wants a little bit of hybrid. So, Rajesh's 90% was interesting. When we ask Australian workers what they would prefer, we get 75%. So not quite as high as 90%. 75% workers say, you know what? I would actually like a bit of time in the office, but I really want a large portion of my time to be remote work. I mean, just out of interest, in terms of your own businesses, how many people would agree, as a litmus across their organisation? Is that the sense you have that it's about 3/4? I'm seeing some nods. Yep. Quick show of hands. Just so I can. Yeah, about a third. So okay, good. Yep. For the others in the room, those who think it would be higher, hands up for those that think they would have more people wanting more remote work, more hybrid work. Want to less? I'm going to assume the balance are no. Or as we have in our surveys, don't know, unsure. That's okay. You're allowed. We always give you that option in Forrester research. And this is the portion that have actually transitioned, or the amount of people that have been transitioned. So on average, 46% of the workforce is fully remote, right? So 75% want hybrid, about half of the employees in Australia have been transitioned to some sort of full remote work model, right? So not everyone. So that does leave us with this challenge of what are we going to do in the meantime. And part of the problem that we're facing and part of the problem that you and I have to solve is that this whole anywhere work model could actually be harder, right, than fully remote or fully in person, right? Because basically the challenge for us is we're also animals that get distracted easily, right? So we like to hang out with each other, but we also get squirrel moments where we kind of get distracted. And so context switching, right, in the work environment is really the enemy of focus, and that's what erodes productivity. And we are now starting to see a lot of questions being asked about, okay, so really how productive are people in this new future of work? And some of that comes down to how often they're having to context switch, right? And that can be context switching in terms of, I'm at home and I'm doing a couple of online meetings, and because I'm at home, I might do some home-based activity, and then I go back to doing some online meetings. The next day, I start at home, I have a meeting, I do some personal stuff, and then I head into the office, I do some office collaboration, and I go home. Same thing, Wednesday I come in, but you get the idea, right? It's just lots of things going on. And there's a physical change as well as a contextual change occurring, right, for that individual over time, right? And that's what makes things challenging. And so what we have to try and do is provide some structure around this in terms of the way in which we can create punctuated moments for people to come in or times that are going to work better for people and how to attract them into the office. And that becomes really important. And part of that means that just because we have gone to fully remote, we can't then sit on our laurels in terms of, okay, well, look, there's not as many people using the office, so let's not invest in some of that high-end VC stuff that maybe we need for when they are there, right? So there's a real trade-off challenge that comes when we try and create a little bit more context and avoid this context switching problem. But sadly, right, if we're going to have to invest to address these problems, what we're not seeing in Australian businesses is organisations willing to make those investments. So when we said, okay, 49% of Australian workers are saying, yeah, look, I don't really get the productive environment that I need. Oh, by the way, you're giving me all this flexibility, so I'm context switching, so my productivity is not as great anyway. But what I really need is probably some decent technology to get the job done. Like only 1 in 4 of us are going to get that money to get the right environment. So this is a real problem. I think, if anything, right, this is probably the thing that's going to bring us unstuck, right, is not having organisations willing to make the investments in the technologies to really make anywhere work. Right? So if anything, I think this is the danger for us at the moment. A lot higher in other markets than here in Australia. Now, that lack of investment, plus the fact that we know that workers who want a hybrid experience are going to be changing contexts, means that you and I have got a whole stack of new challenges we've got to address. We've got to try and work out, if we're not going to get a lot of money, well, where do we start? What should we be doing first? What should we be thinking about? How should we try and address this productivity problem? What type of service can we deliver to our employees and customers to get the best outcome? Who's going to do what? As Rajesh said, right, there's this democratization thing happening now, right? We all used to be in the office. Maybe we had a desk side tech bar, right? But we had a centralized call center, right? So are the tech bar people, because they just happen to be, customer facing or employee facing, are they the people now that have to drive around and do remote support? Or do we need to have a different arrangement, right? What's their job now? If we had 4 of them before because everyone was in the office, now I only need 2 of them on any one shift. Like, what am I doing with my resources? So suddenly we've got our own team of people problem. There's a technical debt issue, right? Do we even have the right technology and solutions? To Rajesh's point, do we have the right platforms to enable this new environment, right? The platforms we have, are they cloud-based and distributed, or are they still stuck on premise? And actually, you know what? The security folk in our team are nervous about us punching holes in firewalls to make that support system active and available to people in a remote environment, right? Why? Well, because we don't have a VPN yet, that's going to take weeks to roll out. You get the idea, right? You've all been there. And then, of course, how do we get employees to use some of this new technology, right? How can we accelerate that democratization process that Rajesh talked about, right? How can we teach them, about the symptoms that they might experience under certain circumstances, how to solve some of that for themselves in a way that will work for them, right? And so we see that. And then, of course, just how we're going to innovate. How do we continue to deal with the changes over time? And changes over time happen. When Forrester moved to remote work, we had a home worker program, a large home worker program, had for 15 years. We decided to go to a model where we're actually going to do 2 and 3. So the expectation was if you were recruited to an office, you would do 2 days. So this is March last year, 2 days in the office, 3 days anywhere you wanted. You had to be able to get to the office on those other 3 days within 2 hours if you were recruited to an office. So you weren't officially a home worker. Sounds complicated, but follow me. We changed that by the middle of last year to fully anywhere. As of a month ago, we've now decided, based on employee feedback and constantly reviewing what we're doing, that actually we're doing a 1 day, everybody in the office, first Wednesday of the month. Everybody, right? Because the feedback was, well, the flexibility is good, but I go in the office, no one's there, right? Now, we tried other things, free lunches, all that sort of stuff, right? But actually, just anecdotally talking to colleagues across the business, the mandate for 1 day a week has actually been something we've all gone, oh, great, good. I've got some structure. I know I've got to be there 1 day a month. Fantastic. Good. Everybody's going to be there. I like that idea. But you can imagine what's going to happen on that day, right? Everyone's going to hit the office, and I worry about Chris, our CIO, and I worry about Nishtha in our Bangalore office, who does all our tech management, that she's just going to get hammered on the Wednesday with tickets because people haven't connected to the network for a month, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. So we've got to kind of really overcome these challenges with best practices. And some of these, I'm sure many of you are doing, but they do require that we have the right set of tools. And so a platform-based approach that will bring together some of these capabilities is really important. So if you think about, we're going to, collect real-time telemetry, but we want to bring that together with qualitative feedback as well, right? Okay, so are we getting qualitative feedback, drop-offs in satisfaction when we know there was something else happening in the environment from a data perspective? What are we doing in terms of thinking about, okay, well, how do we change the teaming structure, right? So instead of having these vertical teams, the desktop, desk-side support team, and some sort of back-end app team, do we need to create a team that actually supports a particular type of worker? So do we need to restructure around product-based teams that are the sales technology support team, right? So do we need to think about different teaming structures, right, and collaboration? Or do we need to embed back out more of our technology people? Do we need to move them around? Do we need to change their roles, set different goals for them? Can we automate those mundane processes, transition to the cloud, get rid of some of that technical debt by basically taking an approach, much like many of you would be doing with Manage Engine, with a vendor that has a consistent platform, be it cloud or on-premise, right? And that can be really important for flexibility. And then finally, can we understand what those kind of challenges are around focus for employees, right? So can we understand what a typical employee journey looks like in the same way that we try and understand customer journeys? And so that's an important technique. So there are these best practices that we can use to overcome some of those challenges that I described, right? Now, some of those are existing practices that we need to just pick up and reuse again, and some of them are new practices. But things like the analytics solution that Rajesh talked about becomes really important in this type of environment, right? Where we need to actually act on feedback based on what it is that we're hearing and seeing from employees. And interestingly, despite the fact that we're not investing in end user employee technology, it turns out that our decision makers are recognizing that we need to invest at least in the platforms that you and I use to support employees in these sorts of endeavors. So when we asked about, in our recent infrastructure technology survey, were you going to adopt end user experience management technologies, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying a platform based approach to the entire employee experience built on the top of traditional ITSM and other things, 72% of decision makers in Australia said, yep, we are, right? Now that's good. So at least we're getting the platform that will allow us to gather some data and hopefully prove to those decision makers where the problems are in the existing experience, so we can ask for that investment increase that we need in those end user technologies, right? But I'm probably preaching to the choir here, with many of you already invested in these sorts of technologies through your Manage Engine relationship. And the one last thing that I want to talk about before I wrap up then is that as you saw Rajesh talk about this idea of kind of the digital experience for employees and experience management as opposed to kind of traditional service management becoming a feature of the future approach to your IT teams, that's one of the things that we've seen as well, is that we're seeing increasingly the emergence within traditional IT organisations of what we've been calling a digital employee experience team, right? And it's a team that, like customer experience teams and employee experience teams, is bringing together analytics built on top of integrated management solutions to better understand what exactly is it that employees are experiencing, not just in the office, but at home and different locations. I mean, in the past, right, all we had to worry about for the most part was, whether or not the office environment was offering a good experience and if the VPN was up and people could get connectivity to it. Now I'm expected to manage that digital experience in lots of different locations, and so that becomes something that ultimately requires a lot of data, it requires a lot of analytics, it requires new skill sets, and it's a new opportunity for us to grow into a new discipline as we start to automate away those mundane traditional ITSM tasks, as we start to introduce AI ops, right, that does a lot of the troubleshooting and fault finding for us, right? The next career move for us as IT professionals in this space, managing complex environments, will be, as Rajesh said, around this idea of managing a digital experience. And a digital experience team built around this type of architecture, right, that actually has a view over the entire landscape, and bringing that together becomes really important. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward here as well. So just to wrap up then, we don't want to miss this anywhere work opportunity. We don't want to erode the employee experience to the point that it starts to impact our customer experience. We want to lift them both up at the same time so we can get that great increase in financial performance. But we need to keep in mind that there are these external shocks that are affecting the traditional way we think about workforces and the way we deal with them. And that, those shocks aren't over yet, right? We talked about the pandemic, and there was a war in Europe. We've got supply chain issues, geopolitical tensions. I mean, the list goes on, right? History tends to repeat itself. Like I say, it's worth going back and having a read of what was happening in the 1920s. I mean, I did a course on Europe since 1870, so I get a little bit nervous when I see these things. So maybe don't read anything, actually, just keep going along. But it is important to understand these shocks impact the way we think about work, and it will continue to do so for the foreseeable future, so we need to be flexible. There is this new reality. Anywhere work is the new reality. I think we have to accept it. I think Elon Musk making statements about what he will or won't do in Tesla is not a good indicator, right, of the litmus of society, certainly not here in Australia. We need to make any in-office, and use that in-office definition broadly, right? You might not have an office, you might just have somewhere that you regularly go as a team, right? But we need to make them purposeful, right? What is it that we're going to do when we go there? And how do we avoid people context switching too often? But at the same time too, watch out for those peaks. Like I say, I'm worried about our CIOs. Our first all office is is Wednesday, the 6th of September. So I'm curious to see what happens to our service desk on that day. Poor buggers. Don't skimp on those digital employee investments. It's great that we're investing in our own tools, right? But we need to do that with a view to generating the information to convince our management that we need to invest in those end user tools, right? That we need to invest in better solutions for them, and we should. Definitely proactively address those end user management challenges. So really consider some of those best practices and some of the ones that Rajesh outlined today in terms of that vision, the democratized IT vision, that future of IT service, with the velocity that he talked about, and with the different team structures. I think that's really important. Create that new vision and include in it the possibility of, creating a digital experience team, a digital experience management team, right? I can remember when help desks were help desks, and then they became service centers, and, so over time we have learned to change the way we operate. So this is another opportunity for us. and continually revisit and refine that strategy. As I say, Forrester's done so. I'm sure you have, and we will continue to do it for the foreseeable future. So with that, I hope that gives you a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the challenges, provides you with some data points that you can take back to your organisation. It's always nice to compare yourself to others, and so hopefully the research that we've provided will give you that. It was a pleasure to be here with you today, and good luck with your Anywhere Work strategy. Take care.